The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. Athens said that to a small island. Then they killed every man and enslaved every woman and child on it. How did the world's first democracy end up here? And what is it that made that passage so famous? This episode, we are going to hear one of the most famous passages written by Thucydides, the Melian Dialogue. In the last episode, when Diodotus saved Mytilene by managing to persuade the Athenians to not execute them all for rebelling, Athens had been at war with Sparta for 4 years. It would be another 11 before the Melian Dialogue happened. But the years in between changed almost everything in the war. The leadership, the mood, the shape of the war, and Athens' understanding of what it was fighting for. To understand the Athenians who sit across from the Melians in 416 BC, you need to know what they went through to get there. So before we reach the Melian Dialogue itself, we need to do some catching up. So, what happened in these middle years? Let's imagine a map of Greece. Athens sits in Attica, the peninsula jutting out into the Aegean in the southeast of mainland Greece. To its north lies Boeotia, dominated by Thebes, historically hostile to Athens and allied with Sparta. To the southwest of Attica, separated from central Greece by the narrow isthmus of Corinth, the Peloponnese, Sparta's home territory. Now the war follows two logics at the same time. The first logic is land, and on land Sparta has the advantage. Spartan hoplites are the finest infantry in Greece, and they can march north through the isthmus of Corinth and ravage the Athenian countryside almost at will, which they do every summer for the first few years of the war. Pericles' strategy had been to absorb these raids and to avoid engaging Sparta on land, and instead use Athenian naval supremacy to raid the Peloponnesian coastline and fund the war through the empire. The second logic is the sea, and at sea, Athens has the advantage. Its fleet controls the Aegean Sea. Its empire stretches across the island chains to the east. The strategic problem for Athens is that it can hurt Sparta on the coast, but cannot go inland in fear of encountering the better Spartan soldiers. And the strategic problem for Sparta is that it can hurt Athens in Attica and on land. But to hurt Athens for real, they need to destroy their navy, which they cannot do. It is a war between a land power and a sea power, and it grinds on precisely because neither can strike the other where it is stronger. After Pericles died of the plague in 429 BC, the leadership passed to a man of a completely different type. You heard him in one of the earlier episodes, Cleon. His argument for killing the Mytileans told you a great deal about how he operated. Aggressive and very effective before a crowd. From roughly 429 BC, just after the death of Pericles, to his death in 422 BC, Cleon was the dominant voice in Athenian war policy, and that voice was always the same. He was extremely hawkish, always pushing for more aggression, no negotiations, trust in Athenian power and push harder. He was about to have his greatest moment, and at the same time, bring both himself and Athens too close to the sun. In 425 BC, the Athenian general Demosthenes, not the speaker of the same name but a military commander, found himself on the western coast of the Peloponnese. His fleet needed shelter, and they landed at a place called Pylos, a small and rocky peninsula on the southwestern coast of the Peloponnese, in Spartan-controlled territory. But instead of setting to sea when the storm had passed, he stayed and fortified the peninsula. He also had his men armed by suspiciously convenient arms transports that arrived to his isolated place, making Donald Kagan argue that the plan to hold Pylos must have been planned all along. When Sparta noticed that the Athenians weren't on Pylos only as shelter from a storm, but that they were fortifying it, Sparta sent forces to dislodge them. First by land, which failed, then by sea, which failed too. Then the Athenian navy arrived after having been informed that Demosthenes' party had fortified Pylos. They drove the Spartan fleet back, and in the chaos that followed, a Spartan force found itself trapped on the island directly opposite Pylos, surrounded by both Athenian ships and Athenian soldiers. This was not a large force of Spartans, but it contained a group of the Spartan ruling class, the best trained soldiers and the absolute elite of the Spartan society. This was a complete disaster for Sparta and a fantastic opportunity for Athens. Sparta immediately sent envoys to Athens to negotiate a truce. They offered a suspension of fighting and the opening of peace negotiations to end the war, in exchange for their elite men. But Cleon argued that they should push for better terms, and convinced the Athenian assembly to reject the offer. He argued that the Spartans on the island could be taken as prisoners, and then be used as hostages to prevent the Spartans from invading Attica, rather than just be traded away. Now this plan was not bad strategically. It meant that Athens would always have a hook on Sparta, and could force them to stay back. But however good this plan was strategically, it meant refusing the best peace terms Athens was likely to ever see. Athens was served a great opportunity to end the war on good terms, but in Cleon's greed, they declined. And in hindsight, this was a massive blunder. The historian Donald Kagan calls this Cleon's defining error. The terms on offer in 425 BC were fair, each side keeping what it held, prisoners returned, and the war ended. But Cleon turned it down because he could not conceive of stopping while Athens appeared to have the advantage. That inability to accept a good outcome in favor of chasing a perfect one would define his career. Now moving on, the Spartans on that island just south of Pylos were still trapped. Now Cleon boasted that he could finish the job in 20 days, and surely enough, he finished the job and took the Spartans prisoner. 292 men were taken as prisoners. This might not sound like much, but 120 of these men were from the elite of the Spartan society. This was Cleon's greatest triumph, and the city awarded him with great prizes. It was also a great source of hubris, which would soon become obvious. The Spartan prisoners became, as planned, a political instrument. As long as Athens held them, Sparta could not invade Attica. The threat of their execution held Spartan armies at bay. Cleon used this as proof that his aggressive stance worked, that every concession his opponents inside Athens urged was cowardice, and that his leadership was the best path for Athens, and that every Spartan request for negotiations should be dismissed. It seems that he had put on blinders. He could not see any alternative routes. He was aiming for total victory. Donald Kagan further points out that what the assembly did not see was that Cleon's rhetoric was calibrated entirely for the short term. Each refusal of negotiations left Athens in a position where it needed the next victory to justify the previous refusal. There was no theory of how the war ended except with a Spartan unconditional surrender. And that was a long shot, since Sparta was still a long way from losing. So while Cleon was rejecting peace terms in Athens, the war was shifting in ways that would matter more. In 424, the year after the capture of the Spartans, Athens attempted to exploit divisions inside Boeotia, the territory directly to its north, dominated by their rival, Thebes. They did this by attacking on land from multiple directions at once. But it failed, suffering serious casualties. It was the kind of embarrassing land defeat that reminded everyone why Pericles had told Athens to avoid land battles altogether. The same year, Athens would suffer more defeats. Thucydides, yes, the historian himself, was in charge of the northern city of Amphipolis, but he lost it to a Spartan force and was exiled for it. Thucydides would spend the next 2 decades watching the war from the outside and writing this very history. The man who took Amphipolis was the Spartan general Brasidas. He campaigned through the northern Aegean with a small force, and he had a different approach. Instead of fighting for territory by conquest, he offered it. He told the Athenian allies he encountered that Sparta had come to liberate them from Athenian tribute and Athenian control, and several of them believed him, or found the offer attractive enough to test. Brasidas destabilized the Athenian Empire in the north, in a way that no amount of Spartan ravaging of Attica had managed to do. So in order to take back and consolidate what Brasidas had managed to undermine, Cleon and an Athenian army sailed north to face Brasidas. In 422 BC, at the Battle of Amphipolis, both Cleon and Brasidas were killed. The double death at Amphipolis was one of those moments that Donald Kagan treats as decisive. The 2 most aggressive war advocates on each side, the men who had most consistently blocked negotiations, they died on the same day. So now the peace parties on both sides could finally be heard. The man who filled the space Cleon left was his opposite in almost every respect. Nicias. He had commanded campaigns without spectacular success, but also without disaster. He was trusted precisely because he was reliable. He had been arguing for a negotiated settlement for years, and now, with Cleon dead and the war in stalemate, the assembly was willing to listen. So in 421, Athens and Sparta signed a 50-year peace. The Peace of Nicias was, on paper, comprehensive. Prisoners were to be returned and territorial arrangements were formalized, and the formal war was declared over. But Sparta's major allies, Corinth, which had been one of the loudest voices to start the war, and Boeotia, which had just beaten Athens in a land battle, they saw no reason to make concessions. They refused to sign. So what followed was not peace and end to the war. It was a strange interlude, neither war nor genuine peace, in which alliances shifted, proxy conflicts continued, and both powers maneuvered for advantage without committing to open fighting. It is in this uneasy interlude that the new generation of Athenian politicians begin to shape events. And the most important of them, the man who would effectively end the peace and set Athens to the path to Sicily, was Alcibiades. You will hear much more about Alcibiades in the next episodes. But for now, know this. He was brilliant, charismatic, and intensely ambitious. He would push Athens into Sicily. He was, in many respects, the spirit of Athens in 416 BC. All appetite, all confidence, and no fear. The mood in Athens in 416 BC was expansionist and impatient. Into this mood came Melos. Melos is a small island in the southern Aegean. Its population was perhaps 6,000 or 7,000. It had been settled, tradition said, as a Spartan colony, which gave it a cultural and sentimental connection to Sparta, even if the military relationship was limited. Throughout the war between Athens and Sparta, Melos had maintained a calculated neutrality. It had not joined the Delian League. It had not paid tribute to Athens. It had simply tried to be left alone. Athens had raided Melos 10 years earlier, but had not pressed the issue. But in 416, the mood had changed. A small island, refusing to acknowledge Athenian supremacy on the seas, had become, to the Athenian way of thinking, an insult that the empire could not afford to ignore. If Melos could sit outside the system, others might try. So 38 Athenian ships were dispatched to Melos, 3,000 soldiers. The Athenians delivered a clear ultimatum: join the empire and pay tribute or face the consequences. But before the military action began, the Athenian commanders asked to speak with the Melian leadership. The Melians agreed, but with a condition. The Athenians would not be permitted to address the people of Melos directly. The conversation would be held in private, between the envoys and a small group of magistrates. The Melians feared perhaps that an open Athenian speech might frighten the population into surrender, or perhaps that they knew their own arguments were fragile and needed to control the room. So the two parties arrived in a hall. The doors were closed. And what followed was one of the most impactful conversations in ancient history. Since the negotiations are not to take place in public, so that we cannot speak uninterrupted before a crowd, and deceive the ears of the masses by persuasive arguments, which would surely pass without refutation. For we know that this is the meaning of us being brought here before the few, instead of the many. What if you, who sit there, were to pursue an even more cautious approach? Rather than delivering set speeches yourselves, take us up at whatever you do not like, and resolve it before proceeding further. But first, tell us if this proposition of ours suits you.
Regarding the fairness of quietly discussing as you propose, there is nothing to object. But your military preparations are too far advanced to be consistent with your words. We see that you have come to be judges in your own cause, and that all we reasonably can expect from this negotiation is either war, if we prove to have the right on our side and refuse to submit, or slavery, if we do not.
If you have gathered to speculate about the future, or for any other reason other than to consult for the safety of your city based on the actual facts before you, we have nothing more to say to each other. But otherwise, we will proceed.
It is natural and excusable for men in our position to consider every possible angle and argument, both in thought and in speech. However, the question before us is, as you say, the safety of our country, and the discussion, if you please, can proceed in the way which you propose.
For ourselves, we shall not trouble you with empty pretenses, either of how we have a right to our empire because we defeated the Persians, or that we are now attacking you because you wronged us, and make a long speech which would not be believed anyway. No, but in return, we hope that you, rather than seeking to sway us by saying that you did not join the Spartans, although you are their colonists, or that you have done us no wrong, and that you will focus on what is actually achievable, keeping in mind the true motives of us both. Since you know, as well as we do, that justice is only in question between equals in power, while the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must.
We speak as we are obliged, since you instruct us to set justice aside and speak only to self-interest. In our view, it is in everyone's interest that you should not destroy what is our common protection. That is, the right, in times of danger, to invoke what is fair and just, and even to benefit from any argument that might help, as long as it is convincing. And you have an interest in upholding this principle too, as your own fall would invite the heaviest vengeance and serve as an example for the whole world to contemplate.
The end of our empire, if end it should, does not frighten us. A rival empire like Sparta, even if Sparta were our real antagonist, is not so terrible to the vanquished as the subjects who by themselves attack and overthrow their rulers. This, however, is a risk that we are willing to take. We will now show you that we have come here in the interest of our empire, but also to ensure the survival of your country, as we would prefer to rule over you without trouble, and your city to be preserved for the good of us both.
Now please do enlighten us. How exactly could it turn out as good for us to serve as for you to rule?
Because you would have the advantage of submitting before suffering the worst, and we would gain by not destroying you.
So, you would not consent to us remaining neutral, friends instead of enemies, but allies neither to you nor Sparta?
No, for your hostility cannot hurt us as much as your friendship would harm us. For to our subjects, your friendship would be taken as a sign of our weakness, and your enmity as a sign of our power.
Is that your subjects' idea of justice? To put those who have nothing to do with you in the same category as your own colonists, or the rebels you've already conquered?
As far as justice goes, our subjects think one has as much of it as the other, and that if any city maintains its independence, it is because they are strong, and that if we leave them alone, it is because we are afraid. Therefore, besides extending our empire, we should strengthen our position through your subjection. The fact that you are islanders, and weaker than the others, makes it all the more important that you should not succeed in defying the masters of the sea.
But do you not see the danger in the course you urge? For here again, if you bar us from talking about justice and invite us to speak only of your interests, we must also explain ours, and try to persuade you that the two can coincide. How can you avoid making enemies of all the neutral cities out there, who will look at our case and conclude that one day or another you will attack them too? And what would this lead to, other than making your existing enemies more numerous, and to force others to become your enemies, who would otherwise never have thought of it?
Why, the fact that continental cities generally give us little alarm. The freedom they enjoy will long prevent their taking precautions against us. It is rather islanders like yourselves, outside our empire, and subjects chafing under the yoke, who would be most likely to take a rash step and lead themselves and us into obvious danger.
If you risk so much to retain your empire, and your subjects risk so much to be rid of it, it would surely be the greatest baseness and cowardice in us who are still free, not to try everything that can be tried, before submitting under your yoke.
Not if you are well advised. For this is not an equal contest where honor is the prize and shame is the penalty, but a question of self-preservation and of knowing better than to resist those who are far stronger than you are.
But we know that the fortune of war is sometimes more impartial than the disproportion of numbers might lead one to believe. To submit is to give ourselves over to despair, while action preserves for us a hope that we may endure.
Hope? The comforter of danger. Hope may be indulged in by those who have plenty to spare, if not without loss, then at least without ruin. But hope is by nature reckless, and those who go so far as to stake everything on it see it in its true colors only when they are already ruined. By then, the realization comes too late to save them. Do not let this be the case with you, for you are weak, and your survival hangs on a single thread. Nor be like the foolish who abandon the practical security that human means can still offer. When visible hopes fail them in desperation, they turn to the invisible, to prophecies and oracles, and other such inventions that delude men with hopes to their destruction.
You may be sure that we are as well aware as you of the difficulty of contending against your power and fortune on unequal terms. But we trust that the gods may grant us fortune as good as yours, since we are just men fighting against the unjust. What we lack in power will be made up by the alliance with the Spartans, who are bound by honor and kinship to come to our aid. Our confidence is not so utterly irrational as you might think.
When you speak of the favor of the gods, we may hope for it just as fairly as yourselves. Neither our claims nor our conduct is in any way contrary to what men believe about the gods or practice amongst themselves. Of the gods we believe, but of men we know that by an unavoidable law of nature they rule wherever they can. And it is not as if we were the first to make this law, or to act upon it. We found it already existing before us, and shall leave it after us to exist forever. All we do is to make use of it, knowing that you, and everybody else with the same power as we have, would do the same. So, as far as the gods are concerned, we have no fear of being at a disadvantage. But as for your belief that honor will drive the Spartans to help you, we admire your optimism, but we do not envy your folly. The Spartans, when their own interests or their own country's laws are in question, are the most virtuous men alive. But of their conduct towards others, much could be said. And no clearer picture of it could be given than by this. Of all the men we know, they are the most accomplished in considering that whatever is convenient is honorable, and whatever is expedient is just. Such a way of thinking does not promise much for the safety which you now unreasonably count upon.
But it is in this very reason that we now trust in their sense of expediency to prevent them from betraying us, their colonists. For to do so would be to lose the confidence of their friends across Greece, and to hand an advantage to their enemies.
Then you do not see that expediency goes hand in hand with security, while justice and honor cannot be pursued without danger. And danger is something the Spartans generally go out of their way to avoid.
We believe that they would be more likely to face danger for our sake than for others. Our proximity to the Peloponnese makes it easier for them to act, and our shared blood ensures our fidelity.
Yes, but what an intending ally relies on is not the goodwill of those who ask for help, but a clear superiority of power. And the Spartans are more mindful of this than anyone. So cautious are they about their own resources that they never attack a neighbor without numerous allies at their side. So tell us, is it likely that, while we are the masters of the sea, that they will cross over to an island?
But they would have others to send. The sea is a wide one, and it is more difficult for those who command it to intercept others than for those who wish to elude them to do so safely. And should the Spartans fail in this, they would fall upon your land, and upon those of your allies whom Brasidas has not yet reached and brought to rebellion. And then, instead of fighting for places which are not yours, you will have to fight for your own country and your own confederacy.
Some diversion of the kind you speak of you may one day experience, only to learn, as others have done, that the Athenians have never yet withdrawn from a siege out of fear of anyone. But we are struck by the fact that, after saying you would consult for the safety of your country, in all this discussion you have mentioned nothing that men might reasonably trust in and be saved by. Your strongest argument rests on hope and the future, and your actual resources are far too meager compared with those arrayed against you for you to come out victorious. You will therefore show great blindness of judgment, unless, after we leave you to deliberate, you can find counsel more prudent than this. Surely you cannot be caught by the idea of disgrace, which, in dangers that are both disgraceful and plain to see, proves so fatal to mankind. Too many men, with their eyes wide open to what they are rushing into, are led on by the mere word, disgrace, until they become so enslaved by it that they fall willfully into hopeless disaster. As a result, they incur disgrace more shameful, one that is born out of their own error, rather than one born out of unavoidable misfortune. This, if you are well advised, you will guard against. And you must surely not think it dishonorable to submit to the greatest city in Greece, when it makes you the moderate offer of becoming its tributary ally while continuing to enjoy your own land. Nor, when you have been given the choice between war and security, will you be so blinded as to choose the worst. For it is certain that those who do not yield to their equals, who keep terms with their superiors, and are moderate towards their inferiors, overall succeed best. Think over the matter after we leave the room, and reflect, again and again, that it is your home you are consulting for, that you have only one, and that upon this single deliberation depends its prosperity or ruin. The Athenians left, the others stayed to think, and the Melians decided to hold out and resist the Athenians in hope of a Spartan relief. So, as they said they would, laid siege to Melos. The Melians held out through the winter of 416 to 415, longer than expected. There were still moments where they managed to bring in supplies. There was still perhaps a hope of Spartan intervention. But it was only hope. No one came. When Melos finally fell, the Athenians carried out their ultimatum without hesitation. Thucydides writes that the Melians surrendered at discretion to the Athenians, who put to death all the grown men whom they took, and sold the women and children for slaves, and subsequently sent out 500 colonists and inhabited the place themselves. Now what does this all mean? And why does it matter? And finally, what have humanity learned from the Melian dialogue? Let's start with the question, what is the Melian dialogue exactly? The Athenians in the dialogue are not necessarily cruel. They are behaving patiently. They explain themselves carefully. They offer the Melians every opportunity to make a sensible decision. They even warn them, gently, that hope is dangerous. And this is Thucydides' point, that the logic they are speaking is not the logic of monsters. It is the logic of empire, followed to its conclusion. Jacqueline de Romilly, one of the great modern scholars of Thucydides, she noticed something about the Melian dialogue. The massacre was not a sudden act of cruelty. It was the end of a long decline, and Thucydides has been showing us that decline quietly from the very beginning of his history. Here's how she saw it. Early in the war, Athenian envoys defended their empire in front of the Spartans. A speech we didn't cover here, but it was a response to the Corinthian speech in Sparta, when they demanded that Sparta should act against Athens. In that speech, they still talked about fairness. They bragged that they treated their subjects better than the Spartans. Justice still mattered to them, or at least they still wanted to be seen caring about it. The same is true with Pericles' funeral oration, where he proudly celebrated the idealism of Athens and the rule of law. Years later, the Athenians are arguing over what to do with the city that rebelled against them, the city of Mytilene. And one speaker, Diodotus, argues for mercy, and he wins. But remember how he won in that speech. He told the assembly, forget about justice. Don't ask about what's right. Ask only what's useful to us. So the Mytileneans were spared, but only because it happened to be the most convenient choice. And then came Melos. By Melos, the Athenians don't even bring up right or wrong. They take it off the table in their very first move. The Athenians at Melos are not the Athenians of Pericles' funeral oration. By this point, they have stopped pretending power needs an excuse. Might, to them, is right.
De Romilly calls this decline the emptying of moral content.
What does she mean by that? Well, the institutions of Athens were still there. The war didn't destroy them. The assembly still met. People still voted. Generals were still held to account. The machine still ran perfectly, but the values that gave the machine its purpose had disappeared. What was left was a fully functioning democracy, voting in good order, but not virtuously. Moving on. What did the Athenian decision mean strategically for the war? Well, the historian Donald Kagan looked at the Melian dialogue from this strategic perspective instead. He thinks that Melos was a catastrophic miscalculation. He argues that Athens gained almost nothing from Melos in military terms. The island had no strategic value that justified a major expedition. What Athens would gain in tribute from the island was also negligible. But what it lost was something harder to measure but far more important: its reputation. The massacre at Melos was carried out at precisely the moment Athens was preparing the Sicilian expedition, which we will come to in the next episode. The most ambitious military venture in its history, an attempt to conquer the Western Greek world. Athens needed allies for Sicily. It needed the Greek world to believe that the Athenian Empire was tolerable. The news from Melos suggested otherwise. Kagan argues that the atrocity hardened resistance across the Aegean and may have contributed, indirectly, to the catastrophe that followed. What has the Melian dialogue actually given us? What mark has it left on history? The political philosopher Michael Walzer takes it up directly in his book Just and Unjust Wars. And he calls the Athenian position the clearest statement of political realism in the Western tradition. This is the view that in international relations morality is irrelevant, and that power is the only currency. He says that no one has ever stated this position more honestly than the Athenians in that room. The Melian dialogue has become one of the foundational texts of international relations theory. It is taught alongside Machiavelli, not as ancient history but as a description of how power actually works. And 24 centuries later, we are still arguing about who was right. Now, let us step back and look at what this series has traced so far. It began with the city arguing whether to go to war at all. Then Athens, at its height, very idealistic, power held with restraint, greatness and decency, speaking with one voice. And then the slope, a vote to massacre a surrendered ally, reversed only at the last hour. Then mercy is entirely out of the question. A small island is told, without apology, that the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. Next time, two men rise to argue about an island far to the west, and Athens votes to gamble nearly everything on the far side of the sea.